Hello, everybody. Hola. My name is Biro. Welcome, everybody. First off, if you do not already have a handset, hearing thing, I mean, if you have the translation thing, if you don't, look to the sides. There'll be people waving, hopefully, for you to grab one if you don't have one, because we will not be speaking in English today. We will be speaking in the mother tongue of one of the great artists that we are able to invite to our humble little festival here in Rotterdam, to the Hilton, where we celebrate cinema and want to continue talking about cinema after the credits have gone, to go just one step further of what that actually means, how that feels, or just simply to say, we think you made an amazing film. Can you just be with us for a little while? And this filmmaker that we want to be with us for a little while is Lucrecia Martel. Ladies and gentlemen, please give her a very warm round of applause. And since we're feeling nostalgic to be here, and since we want to honor the traditions that we have, we asked one of our previous directors, the magnificent Simon Field, to do this discussion today. Please give it up for Simon Field. Enjoy. It's yours.
I'm going to speak in English, and Lucrecia is going to speak in Spanish, thus the need for the translation. So let's make sure it's working properly. Lucrecia's got a bigger seat than I have, which has rather upset me. But it's so that she can relax and lie down if the questions get really boring. So, excuse me while I check my headset. Perhaps we should all check our headsets.
Maybe, can I use it only if I don't understand something? Because...
I think you'll understand, won't you?
Yes, I think so, I hope.
I'll try and make it, this is all tangled up, so I'm just... Is it on?
Yeah, it's on.
Super.
Yep.
I'm going to feel like a Christmas tree by the time I've assembled all of this. Okay. Now, okay. I think I'm ready now. Anyway, it's a very great pleasure to be asked to do this conversation, do this masterclass with Lucrecia. Not least because I think we've known each other for a long time, probably since the Rotterdam years, if not before, or from times when we met in Buenos Aires.
2001, I think.
2001? Yeah. Ah, gosh. And, I mean, it's also a particular pleasure because for those of you who've seen Zama, but also her other films, she is indeed, as Bero said, one of the great filmmakers and one of the most exciting and original voices, I think, in contemporary cinema, who's working to, which is not that common, to really evolve a language of cinema that you see, for instance, in Evidence in Zama. What I propose to do today is to talk with Lucrecia for about an hour or so. We've got some clips. We're going to go through the 4 films that she's made, and with a clip from each, and 2 from Zama, and talk a little bit about her background and the context of making the films, but also we want to take advantage of her being here to really look through these clips at the way that she works with the language of cinema, what her language of cinema is, and it's a very particular one, as we're going to see right away, because let's start with her first feature, very close to the beginning of the film, as you'll see, La Ciénaga, the swamp. Since it's near the beginning of the film, there's no need for any introductory information about where you are or where you're going to be. So, without further ado, let's have a look at a little bit of La Ciénaga.
Señor, gracias por la Misael, gracias por la Misael.
¿Con quién está Joaquín en el cerro? ¡Vamos, gringo!
What is very striking about even this opening sequence is that you're already setting up three strands that run. Well, there are many strands running through the film, but three: the older, rather dissolute, decadent parents, the lost children, and then the two boys who we see again in the film with the guns, and there's a sort of sense of these three different groups that runs throughout the film. Could you say a little bit about, well, first of all, the portrait that you paint of those very decadent adults?
Sí. Hay una cosa que aparece
Yes.
en
Well, I
esa
have to start
secuencia
saying that
que
there's
es
something that we see on that frame. We see
y unas sombras de una
some
persona
shadows
representada sobre el cuadro.
that are projected on a painting of snow, a field with snow
Eso es
that's hanging on the wall. And I think this small detail that we already see in the film is something
y por proyección
that I saw at my family's house
cierta clase
and
media.
that really represents
Y es que mi abuela pintaba cuadros
an Argentinian
y ella pintaba
class.
muchos cuadros
My
con
grandmother
nieve porque le
painted
parecían más
a
elegantes.
lot of paintings, and she liked to paint paintings with snow on them because she thought for them that they were more elegant if they had snow in them. She thought they were more European. She, who had never seen the snow, thought for these paintings to be very elegant, and she decided to hang them on the walls. We see this on the film. And this very small detail, this very small anecdote that I would point out already at the beginning of the film is very peculiar. And I think we see this in Sama as well later on. This is very key if we really want to understand the families that the film analyzes throughout several days of their summer. And I would say that we see middle class or bourgeoisie, Argentinian high middle class that is hanging on to things that cannot be sustained in many ways, unable to really give themselves up to different states in a way. And someone was telling me yesterday, someone that had seen the film, I think it was the wife, Gering's wife. She was talking to me, and Polly is her name. She was telling me about a very concrete link between La Ciénaga and Sama, the giving oneself up to a life that is more in our hands. So taking our lives in our hands. And I hope I don't ruin the film for you. It will be difficult to not to ruin Zama for you, but this is something I would point out. When I decided to write the film, I really took this into account, and there's several elements that I would like to point out just to make a point of it. I have to say that all of the titles of my films, except from Sama, are titles of horror films. The Swamp, The Saint Girl, The Headless Woman. And they're also titles from B-class cinema, or B films. And I hope that this would enable us to see a certain type of humor in films, because I have the impression that, especially my first film and other films, have a lot of intellectual weight, and I think a lot of people stop seeing humor in these films. When I'm writing them, I'm thinking of them as comedies, and if we're patient enough to watch them over again, you will notice some comic, some humorous elements. And then another thing I would like to point out regarding the scene that we just saw and regarding horror cinema is that when the film was launched in 2001, Argentinian cinema was based on costumbrism, or costumbrismo in Spanish. Most films were based on the costumbrism tradition, no? based on customs, on realism, this very general tendency that we saw in Argentina. And I have the impression that this tendency was not loyal to the truth. And I didn't want to follow this same path in Argentinian cinema. So when I started the film, I had some notes on what I wanted to make. It was my first film. It was the first time I was making a long film. And so I decided to denaturalize the spectator's position towards the film, especially a film that was analyzing a family relationship. So that's why I decided to take this zombie-like image, this uncanny image. And for Argentinian spectators, this was very surprising. I guess they can interpret it in many other ways, but I really wanted for my film to not subscribe itself to the Argentinian tradition. I wanted to move away from that Argentinian tradition. I think it was more of a phenomenological question. I just wanted to move away from Argentinian cinema. I hope I answered your question.
You answered many questions, I think. Just to come back to this idea of comedy, or its opposite, if you like, one of the things that strikes me about that opening sequence, and it's something that happens in many of your films, is that with the young boys and the cow, you're already setting up a sort of atmosphere of an undertow of violence in some ways, but of a sort of aggression. And the aggression, I mean, one even sees it in a sequence that follows this, where the aggression takes the form of the fact that the parents take no notice when this woman falls over and cuts her hand on glass. They just carry on drinking. And it seems to me quite often in the films, for me, there's a sense of uncertainty which often connects with a feeling of threat or violence. which is opposite to the comedy, but they like coexisting.
Es algo que también estaba
Yes, indeed.
concepto sonoro de
The
la película
sound concepts that we see in the film, the different sounds that we see in this opening sequence, they open with a storm, the sound of a storm. Salta is a city that is located in a valley surrounded by mountains, and usually when storms come to the town of Salta, they don't go over the mountains to the valley, they just stay in the mountains. And so the sound of the storm really resonates within the valley of Salta, and this really feels like a threat when you're there, when you're hearing the storms in Salta. And well, some may see it as a religious sound, a religious sign, and this was the general construction that I decided to build within the sound of the film, and it's something that was present as a basic structure for the whole film. The film was based on threat, the idea of threat, a threat that is very latent, that is very close to the characters, and we don't know if this threat will get close to the characters or not. And within the narrative line of the film, what I really try to make is to tell a same story in many different ways. So we see, for example, this idea of threat that is present in the sound of the film. We see it in the situation, for example, the situation of the cow and the little children, the sounds of gunshots. We see an imminent threat that is present throughout the film through many manifestations, through many ways. And I thought this was very important for the threats to be multiple, to have many possibilities of risk exerted on the characters' bodies, risk present in the mountains, heard from far away. Something could happen to the characters that are close to the swimming pool as well. So we see imminent threats being present in many ways, keeping a general structure within all of the scenes. So for threat to be manifesting itself in many ways. I hope I'm answering your question correctly. I hope so.
The other thing, I mean, you mentioned Salta. Just to add a sort of biographical element, this is where you were raised and this is where you live, right?
Sí,
yeah. Which is out in northern Argentina, away from Buenos Aires.
Indeed. And Salta is a place that is not mentioned in the film itself. I think the first time we mention Salta is in Sama. In the film Sama, the main character says that he wants to go back to Lerma, which is the old name of the city of Salta. I think it's a more psychological element for me, because I had the feeling that if I did mention Salta, I would make it commonplace. And I think if I am using the name of Salta, I would be making it my own, and I didn't want to include it in films. Maybe this sounds stupid, but the city where I was born, the city where one is born is such an imaginary field. So if I add it there, I feel like I'm stealing something from the city if I include it in the films. I don't know if this makes sense.
But is this something that, I mean, is it therefore, since you were born there and lived there, is that a portrait in some ways of the bourgeoisie as you see them in that city?
Well, it is inevitably, because all of the situations take place in that social framework, which is the social framework in which I was raised. But that wasn't my objective. My aim was not to make something about class, or of course I have certain political convictions regarding cinema, but that wasn't my aim. I didn't want to go within these, to dwell deep within these topics. I wanted to tell things that are close to me, stories of my family, my friends, and I wanted to share them with people and see whether we saw something that wasn't working, things that weren't working in our families. And that's what I hope to do with cinema in the end. I don't think I can use cinematic tools in order to make great denunciations or to make a great transformation. I think the greatest thing I can do is to look at the things that I'm closer to and things towards which I have a very strong responsibility, towards which I can do something and towards which I can be critical. So I recognize that that cinema's largest poverty is that it is a way by which white supremacy has expressed itself, and I cannot make myself a black person to give another perspective. I wish I could, but I can't. So the only contribution I can make to the poverty in cinema is by making criticism and hoping that through this we can improve the perspectives that are reflected. And I hope we can give access to cinema to other people, because at this point 80% of cinema is based on high-class, middle-class white people. And yeah, I see a certain poverty in this.
You mentioned that you're not a black person, so you can't. But one of the things that struck me in looking at La Ciénaga again was that the depth of insult, if you like, towards the Indian population, the maid, and I mean I mention that now because in a sense it's going to be something that we'll touch on later. But throughout your films, there's reference, often very subtle, but very much to the relationship between the white people and the indigenous people. I mean, we'll talk about it in Headless Woman, for instance. But that's a strand that seems to me extraordinarily strong through the films.
Yes, indeed. And to be honest, what I'm trying to do is not to write too many dialogues. I don't want to put words on someone's mouth if I don't share the same experience as these characters, because I think words have quite a lot of weight to them. So what I try to do is to describe things from my position, Latin American woman, white, middle class. And from that perspective, I try to be critical and try to, and as far as possible, because it's difficult to have characters coming from different worlds and being completely precise. So what I try to do, well, you see this in La Ciénaga and in The Headless Woman. We see that discourse in these films is based on middle class, and which other elements from other classes are seen as ghosts. In The Headless Woman, we see one of the women that says the espantos, certain ghosts or figures that are surrounding the characters. No one knows about them, but they're present. And that is what I wanted to portray in these films, to portray the relationship that is established between different classes. But I'm really trying to be careful and not inventing. I don't want to invent emotions or give words to characters that I don't know, whose experience I haven't lived, because there's different dimensions, and I think this is essential. If I open lukewarm water to take a bath, and it takes me 23 seconds to obtain this water, and if for another person it takes 3 hours to obtain warm water because this person has to go get the water and then warm it up, our experiences, our time frame, our life experience is completely different. And if we look at the different spatial categories, the different time frames, these are completely transformed in different people's lives. So I'm in no position to make a judgment or to be clear about a time frame that I'm unaware of or that I haven't lived. And this may sound extreme, but I hope for it to be this way in my films. I hope to be. I prefer to be extreme, because I think that poverty really creates differences in our time frames, and the differences in our time frames are so far away from each other that it is very difficult to make judgments. So I don't want to make any judgments.
Continuing a little bit this idea that the films are very close to you, let's move on to The Holy Girl. We've got a clip from some way into the film, and perhaps those of you who haven't seen it should know that basically it's about a group of, well, it's about many things as always, but a group of young girls who seem to be having religious education, and a lot of the education that they have is taking place in a hotel where there's also a visiting group of doctors who are coming for a conference. And one of the young women, Amelia, is at the center of the film. So so you're going to see a moment with her and one of the doctors.
Doctor, ¿cómo anda? ¿Qué tal? ¿Bien? ¿Viste la maravilla que es esto? ¿Viste que no toca nada? Nada. Mirá vos, esto es una cosa sí. Qué bueno, extraordinario. Estaba yendo. Bueno, nos vemos. Pero bien. Doctor. Doctor Jano. ¿Qué tal?
Esta mañana vi salir de una habitación a una de esas chicas del laboratorio. Creo que era una promotora. Esto es un congreso, no es un casino. Y no es la primera vez en la semana. Pero esto es un congreso de medicina. Es una semana de decencia que se pide nada más. No me parece tanto.
There are many scenes in the film where Amelia is either singing religious songs or quoting religious texts, but at the same time one sees a growing sensuality, so that the film somehow balances between the religious drive and the adolescent growth into sexuality. This is the second time, by the way, there's a scene like this with this extraordinary music, because the first time any sort of encounter takes place, I think, between Dr. Jano and Amelia is in a similar moment when they both go to hear this strange musician. And so it's a sort of repeat of that scene. But I'd like to talk a little bit specifically about the scene and how you made it, how it works. But perhaps you could first say a little bit about that way in which the film, it seems to me, is about not the conflict, but the relationship between religiosity and growing sexuality.
Yes, and there's another theme that we see there, the impossibility of tracing a clear line between the good and the evil. And we see this also in sound. I have an experience. When I was 11, I was in my grandmother's home. I think I was playing alone in a room, and then I heard a sound coming towards me. It was coming from a wall. There was a wall with no window, and it was a sound like woo, a very deep sound. Someone that was coming to. It felt like it was someone coming towards me. It was a very strong sound. So I started screaming, Grandma, it's the devil, it's the devil. And as the sound was coming towards me, I was thinking about this, and then I suddenly started thinking, it's God. So I said, Grandmother, it's God, God is here. And then after this, I started thinking, I felt a bit traumatized, and I started thinking about this. I think this definitely pulled me out of the Catholic Church after this experience. I mean, I was very devout at some point, but I noticed that the unnatural aspects of God's, or the supernatural aspects of God's, or the devil is the same in the end. The devil is as supernatural as God. This is what I would think then. At that point, I noticed, I came to the conclusion that it's such a great field that even if God appeared or the devil, it would have the same effect on me. It's such great powers coming onto us. So from this very small childhood experience, I went to an existential doubt in adulthood, and this film is really based on this idea in the end. It is also based on another idea that I also developed in The Headless Woman, that I also believe to be one of the most interesting things about cinema, or what cinema can tell us about the world, and it is the relationship between cause and consequence. How is this relation built? What is a cause and what is a consequence? I assume we have shared the same readings. If we look at the script writings, Setfield's script writing books, different books that analyze script writing and the narrative, the hegemonic narrative system. If we look at the relationship between cause and consequence in these books, we have to start thinking about the logic within cause and consequence, or the way in which events are built. Because something that it is something that we should take into account when writing and when talking about cinema. We have to look at the ethics with which we relate a cause to its consequence. If we look at cinema from this perspective, strictly from this perspective, we would start thinking and understanding something that I was mentioning in Spain not so long ago, and that I received many insults about. I'm not present in social networks, but I heard about the general comments. We see that TV series are now extremely successful and undoubtedly better than the ones that we saw in the 50s and 60s. Not all of them, but many of them. And I was saying that TV series are following the same narrative model, and there's not many exceptions. I have read many reviews about series, and if I think of the narrative model that they use, series are going back to a stage that was very far back in cinema, that we had moved away from already. So I have the feeling that we're going back. If we look at sound cinema, sound film or documentaries, we see that cinema has reached a narrative complexity, a philosophical complexity, and at the same time we have this hegemonic model represented by series. So it is not to be surprised that a young child or a 90-year-old woman like Breaking Bad as a series. And I'm not doubting the fact that they're successful series and that they're well built. But I have the impression that we cannot separate this narrative model, this absolute narrative model that is present within all of the series, from the political situation in the world, which is extremely conservative at this point. So if we look at cause and consequence, it's not just a way of organizing things. Cause and consequence is present in the way we build a character, in the way we build a story, and it is also present in every scene, every action represented in the scenes. So if this discussion is not on the table of cinema, if we don't discuss the relationship between cause and consequence, I think we're definitely missing out on something that is phenomenal in our era. If we don't establish a clear relationship between the narrative system that is currently being applied with a lot of success, and if we don't put it in relation with a conservative political model, then I think we're definitely missing something that is very important. If you see what I mean. I of course think that, as I mentioned before, cinema is dominated by white supremacist theory. So where were we at? I think I took the discussion somewhere else, I'm afraid.
Well, I'm tempted to try and relate that discussion of cause and consequence to that particular scene, but it's perhaps something we can come back to, because I'm dying to ask you about your casting and choices of actors and actresses. And I say that because one of the things, and we'll see a little bit of it in The Headless Woman, is that one of the very striking things about your films is the concentration on the face and on the reaction of the face. We'll talk about that perhaps a little bit in Zama too. Or it also manifests itself in terms of the way a face may be looking off screen and there's something we don't know that is there. It might be somebody speaking, or it might be something that coming into the frame, but the casting is, it seems to me, incredibly important, and that's exemplified in this film by the extraordinary choice of the actress to play Amelia. I mean, was she, for instance, a professional actress, or how did you find her? Because she has a face that's completely different from the other girls, although there's great variety amongst them anyway.
Yes, when I decided to organize the casting for Niña Santa, the Saint Girl, I had in mind the women that we see on the prayer cards, the saints that are on prayer cards. I have a collection of prayer cards, and I was thinking of these saints girls, and I see they have a lot of aspects in common, and that's what, if you look at prayer cards, you'll see it. If you go to a church, you'll find these cards. Saints are usually portrayed with a gaze that is staring towards the sky. So we see that their iris of their eyes and the lower part of the eye has a lot of white. So it's as if someone wants to look at the mirror with that gaze, we see that it's a very concrete gaze, no? The saint gaze. It's not that they're looking at the sky. It's they're looking above, no? So Maria Alche, the actress that is going to launch a film within a few months. She was an incredible actress. At that time, she was very young. She was only 8 years old, 18. And at that time, she had some experience in theater, but she had hardly any experience. But we see the other girl, Josefina. I had already worked with her when she was very young in a childhood program that took place in Buenos Aires. I met her when she was 12. They both came to the casting. It was an open casting, so I had interviews with about 2,400 girls, and we decided to select 50, and then from those 50, we tried to do rehearsals with girls by dividing them into groups of 2, and then in the end we decided to choose Maria and Julieta as main actresses. And you were asking why do we do this casting? Because sometimes we see that publicity tends to have the same pitfalls, but we see this in cinema as well. When we organize castings, we think that the casting is a place in which the actor is going to prove their talent to us. So they're going to prove to us that they're the best actor for the film. But in the end, casting is not about proving talent. It's a moment in which we are able to see if you can talk, to have a conversation, a very sincere conversation with another person. I have had incredible castings with Argentinian actors with whom I couldn't have a proper conversation. I couldn't have an honest discussion. So in the end, what we look at castings is the possibility of communicating between two people, because for certain roles, we can have very good actors, but maybe they don't have the experience of other very well-known or professional actors. And sometimes the results are better because there's more understanding between the director and the actor. Casting is not something that we can delegate to someone else. And of course, a part of the casting could be delegated, but there's a part of the casting that is crucial, and it's the one that is based on dialogue and being in contact with the other, being able to communicate among each other. So in the end, casting is all about testing oneself. If you think that casting is about testing someone, it will just put this person under a lot of stress, and it won't be good for the film in the end.
And what about the doctor? Was he also a professional actor, or because he has a very unusual face? He's not. Although she's one of the striking things about the film as well, when you spoke earlier about good and evil not being necessarily opposites or overlapping. I mean, she actually is the voyeur in the film in many ways, and the object of her voyeurism is a man. I mean, there are more handsome doctors, but he has this strange face, which we saw there in that clip, emerging from behind the scenes. I mean, what were you thinking about when casting him?
Ese actor es un actor que siempre hizo de monstruo.
The actor played as a monster, always played as a monster in Argentinian cinema and also in Argentinian theater. And we were talking about him for the casting. I was telling other people, and they said, no, you need another actor, another type of person, not a monster. But it was interesting. I mean, when he's invited to a project, he already knows he will be playing the monster. This was the type of actor we had. So it was, for me, it was interesting to start thinking about what he could contribute to the film when we invited him. I think he really had to work on his human qualities in the end, because he hadn't trained them in so much depth. Yeah, indeed, he has a very special face, as you said. But at the same time, I thought that you could also see a person trapped in his own clothes. I wanted to portray someone that was really trapped in his own medical profile, so to speak. And I really thought about this. For this character, we also considered Jimenez Cacho, which is the protagonist in Sama. But in the end, we decided to have the other actor.
I mean, I'd like to talk more about this perhaps after we've looked at another clip, but one of the things that's striking in this film and in La Ciénaga is the work that you do with adolescents or with children. In La Ciénaga, there are very complicated multi-shot scenes and things. I was curious to know whether you actually improvise or storyboard, or how do you approach these sort of group scenes that work so well in the films?
El storyboard, la verdad, no me sirve porque me resulta muy difícil pensar la imagen de la película.
I think it's very difficult to think about images before being on set. It's not. I can have general ideas about the lighting that will be used, a lot of ideas about sound and the sounds I want to incorporate into a frame and into the image. But I find it very difficult to really know how I will frame the film until I am there with the actors being present. I sometimes organize a floor so that we know where each one of us will be located, but in the end this is losing time, because once we're on set we realize that maybe we have to see things through another perspective. So I can afford to do this because I don't film so much. I don't make so many films. I don't, and I also don't take that many shots per day. So I can afford to lose 20 minutes at the beginning of the day, at the beginning of the shooting, so that I can consider which is the best place to film. Because in the end, I know that I will make 3 takes or 4 takes for one scene, and I want to find the best take and the best recording. Directors that use many takes have to use different strategies, so I can afford to take more time. And something that is very crucial in the framing of the scenes, I know what the sounds will be in the scene, so for me, sounds is a lot more telling than the traditional means that cinema uses. So I try to establish the moods and the general lines of the scene through sound, so I don't really need to pre-establish the space where we will be doing the film, and I really trust the telling capacities of sounds and the film construction. So I know which elements will be off and which elements will be on. So this really reduces the number of images that we end up seeing on the film. And I really had to train this. I noticed this when I was filming adolescents. I noticed that using off elements could have a very strong narrative power, a very strong narrative force. And this is why I decided to not use a very large budget for Latin American or films that I made in Latin America. I had very concrete ideas on the soundscape. The sound concept enabled me to save on costs as well. And I can give you an example of a scene. I can make a list of the problems or the defects that my films have, but there's, for example, a scene where I was too much of a director in the swamp. I'm thinking of it now because I remember we had 900 meters of film material, not a lot of film. and we had to film that part where the children are around the pool, and it was I had a very long text read by non-actors about the rat dog, the rat dog anecdote. That was to be very long, and I had an idea, a very concrete idea of the tale and how this was to be filmed, and I had a very concrete idea of the different shots that were going to be part of the frame. But I also noticed that the fact that my sounds were very clear to me, that I knew which sound I was going to use, that enabled me to save time and use it in a better way. And regarding children and non-actors, what you were asking, what I usually recommend to young directors and students is not to use written scripts with children, because written words can really define a bodily organization that is very extreme, and it's very difficult to move away from it as an actor. A non-actor, non-professional actor really wants to contribute to the film and is very enthusiastic, so in the end they will end up learning their script by heart, and in the end the way written language is ordered can really influence one's body, and it's very difficult to move away from it, to move away from the perfection that is so present in written form. So when I work with non-actors, with non-professional actors, and with children, I really try to... I give them some lines, but we already go through a process of me telling them about different sentences that have the same meaning. So giving them many options, many tricks, so oral tricks, oral language, so that they don't stick to the written form.
Speaking again of sound, one of the well, I'd like to talk about some of the music you use in Zama later. But here, it's interesting that you chose to have this encounter in the streets with this very strange musical choice, if you like.
Termin box,
yeah. And you were thinking of sound, presumably, in relation to the nature of the scene that was taking place.
Yes, of course. I mean, it was an obvious choice, but I have to say that terim, the musical box, is also present in fairs, and it's a toolbox that is not very legitimate, so to speak. It doesn't have the same legitimacy that fine arts could have. It's more of a small gadget, art fair kind of tool. So I like this about it. And now thinking about cause and consequence, we can think of the consequences of not playing. I don't know if you know those termin boxes. It's a box which has pitch and volume with electromagnetic fields, and you work with your hands to create different resonances in the box, and this music can be used in many ways. So in the film, I wanted to use this box that doesn't have the same presence of piano or a violin, doesn't bring a classical element to it, an element that is now very present in our culture. So I wanted to make full use of it because of that. And thinking of cause and consequence, if we think of the sounds of these boxes, they are played without playing in the end, in a way, right? So I thought this links with my idea of comedy and humor. I thought it was good to use it because what happens in the scene is that Amalia is being touched in the scene by the doctor, touching without being touched. So see, that's why comedy cannot be understood sometimes.
Let's move on to the Headless Woman, and perhaps come back to this cause and consequence a little bit. And also in a way to what you touched on in your opening remarks when you were talking a little bit about genre, because it seems to me in a perverse way, this is the Headless Woman is a thriller without a conclusion, shall we say. I mean, for those of you who haven't seen it, and just to explain the clip very briefly, the opening of the film is that of a woman, middle-aged woman, driving and along a road, and she hits something, and she obviously has hurt something, and she doesn't look back, if I'm correct. The camera looks back, and we see a dog on the road. But she doesn't look back, and the rest of the film, in many ways, is her anxiety about who or what she might have hit. And the sequence we've taken to show you is the sequence where she happens to be driving past the scene where she had the accident, and there are various firemen and police investigating something by the side of the road. Let's have a look at that clip.
Están buscando algo.
Hay algo en el canal. A ver, seguí. Seguí.
¿Qué pasó?
No están queriendo decir nada los bomberos. Se tapó la alcantarilla. Puede ser una persona o un ternero, porque el canal el año pasado arrastraba un animal y se atacaba.
Mamá, cerró la ventana que entra un olor inmundo.
Gracias. Pongo el aire.
I mean, it's interesting to contrast it with the previous clip. It's all one take. And what is striking about it as well, to me, in terms of your style in cinema, is that it doesn't take the position of a point of view shot. We're seeing from the back of her head. So we see her thoughts, or we think about what she's thinking, and the camera moves off and comes back again. And in this film, there's an incredible concentration actually throughout on her face and her expression, because she's having this crisis about what exactly she did. And at various points, there are things like the damaged car. There are this case here of what is in the canal. Is it something that she caused? Is it a body, etc.? The feeling of uncertainty, which is often very characteristic of your films, is exemplified in a way, in one particular way, in this sequence.
Sí. Hay una cosa que pasa en esta secuencia.
Yes, and there's something that we see in this sequence that I find very striking, that something that we can see in our daily lives, which is when a tragedy takes place, there's a point in which you cannot do anything, you're helpless in a way, and there's always a large amount of people. We see firemen when someone drowns, or when there's a fire that took place somewhere, we find a dead body. And this is something we see a lot in Argentina, no? Dead bodies and accidents, and we see a lot of policemen, soldiers, a lot of people that are worried about the situation, that feel helpless about the situation. They see witnesses, we see that they find themselves in a situation where tragedy has already taken place. So we are only left as witnesses, and we're trying to find out who was responsible. But anything that was important before is lost at that point, and I think that was very present on this take. And music is a small tribute to the dead. The music you hear from the car radio is like a tribute to the dead, and it's all taking place simultaneously in the same take. We see her from a frame perspective that is far away from her, and this is because when you're filming as a director, you have to hope for the character to do something that is not on scripts, and this was not on scripts, but the Headless Woman has to take responsibility, not guilt, because guilt is useless, but she has to take responsibility. This is something that was present in the film, and I wanted to really portray it. I wanted to portray the main actress that was playing Veronica as someone that is observing, that is being observed by the camera, and then from the camera, we're expecting her to react. And sometimes we don't trust this, but when we look at the attention that we give to the frame, when we see the tension that is built from that perspective, in the end, through that tension that is present there, it can happen. It can end up happening. She can end up taking responsibility. And if we look at analog cinema, I was never nostalgic about the retro cinema or analog cinema, but there is something that I miss about this type of cinema, and it's the sound of the camera that is always present, because when we heard that sound in cinema, people tended to concentrate on the image. Someone told me about the filming of Ciénaga. They told the actors that were present there. It was Graciela Borges, and she gave me one of the most important lessons. She told me that when the camera is making noise, all of our work ends up falling in a very dark pit. And it's true in the end. Unfortunately, we don't have this sound with new cameras. I wish we could. I wish we could add, that filming sound to the new cameras. Maybe someone will hate me in the room, but I think this background sound could really help, so that the whole team, the whole filming crew and cast can expect something to happen, and then it doesn't happen. And that's fantastic about cinema. We're expecting for something supernatural to come, and then it ends up not happening. So when we're filming a take, this is also a sacred moment. Why do I say this? Well, it's sacred because all of us are building something. We have words that have been written for the film. We've chosen concrete clothes. We've chosen a place, the lighting, and so on. And we're expecting for something to happen, something unexpected, something that is beyond our control in production, something that can only happen in that very concrete frame of time, in that very specific moment, with the joining of all of those elements, something that could happen. And that's the feeling I have. That's the only thing I miss about analog cinema, the sound of the camera, because the impression that I have now, the fact that you have an infinite storage space, that you can have different storage cards, and you have the feeling that memory cards, flash cards are now infinite and powerful, and I'm not fully comfortable with this. I think it can be good for some films, but I think it's too much, this feeling of it being infinite.
You're not of the view that actually the quality of the blacks and other images that you can get with 35 is something that is lost with digital?
Yo la verdad que me imagino que hay
No,
cosas que se han perdido,
to
pero
be
no-
honest,
no me
we've
preocupan.
lost some things, but they don't really concern me. We've been able to obtain other things indeed, but this doesn't worry me at all.
Quizás porque toda mi
And maybe this is due to the fact that if we look at it from a narrative perspective, I tend to build my films from a different place, from a place that is away from digital, or digital gives me more than what I would ask for. And I had the same with analog, so in the end it's just material that is offering me a lot more than what I could use.
To go back to one of your early remarks, you spoke of the titles being of horror film titles. Could you say a little bit about the title of Headless Woman? What's the implication of that title in relation to the woman we see in the film?
Yo no sé si alguien habrá tenido acá un accidente, seguro que sí.
I'm not sure if there's someone in the room that has had a strong accident, one of those very traumatic car accidents. I had one when I was small. I was 5 years old. We fell down a cliff with a car. In Salta, we have a lot of mountains with very narrow roads, and we fell from the roads in one of the cliffs. And I remember the first days after such a traumatic event, one is left feeling helpless. In the end, your relation to words and to things is fragile. You feel fragile, and your relation to things also becomes very fragile. If we look at indigenous medicine, popular indigenous medicine that is used in the north of Argentina, which is what saved me after this accident, in this medicine, they have different methods of analyzing traumatic events, and they call it the susto. Shock therapy. So, shock or fear therapy. I'm now speaking to the interpreter. So it would be like shock therapy, like fear therapy. And this disease, or shock disease, so to speak, is what this medicine talks about. So they look at the body as a painful field. And so the painful field of the body ends up pulling the soul away from it. And the soul is left far behind at the place of the accident. And this makes sense because the body is still perceiving the soulless soul, the soulless body is no longer aware of its relation to things, or the relation that is established between things. So this is the general states of a body without a soul, is the states in which I based the scripts and the film of The Headless Woman. I really wanted to pull the soul back into the body, and what popular medicine does to pull the soul back into the body is to go. They ask you to go back to the place of the accident, or another person has to go for you. You have to go with another person, and they have to pull the clothes around the ground towards the earth of the ground, because it seems that the souls are found at earth level, at ground level, and you have to pull the clothes. And so they would have, in my case, they have to say Lucrecia. They should have said it, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But so they have to call the soul back from the earth, and then you have to take those clothes and pull them back in contact with your body. We're now laughing at it, no? It may seem ridiculous, but it may not be absurd to go back to the place of the accident. That makes sense. And there lies the intelligence of traditional medicine, because you go back to the place of the accident thinking that you will heal, that encounter with the place of the accident will be healing, will have healing powers. And for me, it was very useful to go back to the place that had healing powers. In my case, my mom was there with me, and she did not do the circle with clothing, and so to find myself back. So that would be the state. I decided to base the character on a state of shock, of fear.
Let's move on to Zama, which is your first digital film, the first adaptation, also in a way too the first film with a male lead, and it's based on a very famous Argentinian novel by Di Benedetto. So it would be interesting to talk about adaptation, but let's take a look at a little bit of it. It's about a man who is waiting for a letter that will enable him to move to join his wife in what seems a far distant country, to some extent, to simplify it. And this is the scene, one of the scenes, one of the remarkable scenes in the film, in which he discovers what is happening. So let's take a look.
Mensaje para Diego Lezama.
Soy yo. Habla.
El gobernador dice que te vayas.
Que me vaya.
Que te vaya a su despacho. Ha llegado correo.
¡Se terminó!
Of course, I can't resist asking you about the llama.
Eso en verdad no estaba en el guión.
Well, to be honest, this wasn't on the script. We saw a llama at the filming spots, and since we were talking about Lerma, the city, which is the region where I come from, where we see llamas, I decided to lock the llama in the office space and see what happens. That's something I said, and since I don't believe in God, we decided to create the scene.
Because actually, one of the other striking things in the film is there's with animals which is actually in the little trailer, which is when a horse towards the end turns and looks at the audience as if it's breaking the fourth wall. You know, it's really, but that in a way also touches on the fact that to some extent this is indeed a comedy, right?
Bueno, lo que yo digo.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
But could you talk a little bit about this scene, because it's interesting that first of all it touches on what you've been saying about sound. The off-screen sound is there, and there's obviously the way in which the llama creates this strange sort of relationship between nature, which is, you know, independent of actors, and but also it's providing a sort of commentary on the scene. I feel the llama is.
Sí, me
Yes.
parece que, pero fue una casualidad.
But this was totally random. This was a coincidence.
Hay una toma que creo que
And in fact, there's another take
quizás
in which
esa toma está bárbaro, pero quizás estaba mejor, pero la
there was
combinación
also
del
an
con
accident.
la
We
llama,
combined him
hizo
with
que elijamos
another
finalmente esa toma.
llama.
Porque, por supuesto, la
We
llama
decided
en cada
to
toma hacía
use this
cualquier cosa.
final take because we had llamas doing all sorts of things in different takes. We decided to choose this one in the
Una
end.
cosa que era interesante, porque más o menos siempre
And
la
then
hizo, es
there
que
was
las llamas
something
son muy
very
curiosas.
interesting. In the end, llamas are
Entonces,
very
me daba mucha curiosidad la cámara.
very curious animals. They have a lot of curiosity and they like to look at the camera. So in all of the takes, I have llamas looking straight into the camera. And sometimes this breaks the magic of cinema, no? In many ways. But there's something that happened during the filming. I decided to film in a very classical way. And I would even dare say that it was a very TV-based filming. At the beginning, I was very scared of following this line, but in the end, I decided that it was good. We have many frontal cameras, frontal takes, direct takes, but I had the feeling that the theme that we were treating was very complex, so the simplicity of the filming was not going to affect the film. I had to think of this while I was watching the scene.
Let's quickly look at another clip, which in a way is an echo of the one you've just seen, and then open up for people to ask questions, and then we can also explore Zama a little bit more. So let's take a look at the final clip, which is later on in the film. Well, let's just run it and see.
Anoche me he despertado y he visto algo que me caminaba por el cuello. Hago así y no sé, me siento un poco rara.
Está hinchada. Debe ser la avispa Pompi.
No, una araña.
Just a couple of quick questions, and then open it up to people who have questions on the floor. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, without giving anything away, was about composition and about the depth of field and of what is, because this film, one of the great pleasures for me was that it's a very painterly film. The whole series of compositions, in a way, which are extremely pleasurable to the eye. But it's clear, for instance, I'm thinking of these group scenes in which we're now meeting the third governor, I think it is, who's making his life disappointing. But when you were thinking of these group figures, and you're always thinking, it seemed to me, of what is happening both close to the camera and far away. I mean, everybody does, but you articulate it in a very particular way.
Eso es porque también filmo pocas tomas.
That's because I also don't use many takes. I film without using many takes, so I try to use the least takes to tell the most possible, for the takes to be very telling. The depth of field enabled me to juxtapose many elements and to be very concise. And I also believe that it is very human to take many things in one take. It's a human pleasure to see so many things in a single take. So maybe because I use so much depth of field, I don't take so many takes, or maybe it's because I don't use that many takes that I have such a depth of field. Maybe it's both that are interrelated. But in any case, my references for the film weren't paintings. I did use combinations of color, or the color palette that we used in Sama comes from the Baroque in the Chaco region in Argentina. We had Jesuit missions that were established in the south of Bolivia, and there they have religious paintings called the Chiquitanías from the Chaco region that are stunning. They're stunning, and they're very related with the history of the country, because many of the Jesuits that went to that region came from that very same area as we see in the film. Maybe there's a Dutch element to the film, Dutch painting going through Bolivia. In any case,
hay un efecto especial que lo voy a revelar.
there's a special effect we see here, and I will reveal it because some of you can use it. In the take where we see the spider bites, someone has a hands that is bigger, that is inflamed, and it's hands from someone that is behind the actor. I don't know if you can show the image again, but we see a character that is in this position with his hand like this, and there's another one sitting next to him. But the hand on his left is from the person that was behind him. We decided to combine it so that hands would look different, but indeed it's two different hands from two different actors. But you don't see it so clearly in the end. And we decided to keep the secret for masterclasses in the end.
Just one last question from me. We talked about music, and I was curious about the music that we've just heard, but also the sound that you use in the scene with the llama, which is a sort of falling tone.
Sí, el Shepherd Tone fue lo primero.
Shepherd Tone
esa ilusión auditiva
the auditive illusion of a downfall. No, it goes like continuously, and it's two different scales, two different sound scales that we use and juxtapose so that we have that downward fall effect. And this was very useful for the film. It is used in science fiction cinema, and I thought it was interesting to use it for this film because in one way or another, the experience that I had before writing Sama, when I was thinking about time, before writing Sama, I was thinking of adapting a science fiction comic strip called Eternauta by an Argentinian author. I wanted to adapt it into film before I wrote Sama. And I believe that we take more freedom. When we write science fiction, we represent things. When we represent the future, we take more freedom. When we think about sounds in future tense, we take more freedom. For all of the ones that are involved in cinema, we decide to take a lot of freedom in representing in cinema. But when we think about the past, we don't take the same freedom. We tend to limit ourselves. And I thought it was important, also for political reasons, to really keep the same freedom, to keep our horizon open. And I think this really enabled us to build the possible universe in the past. If we decided to stick to the lies of Latin American history, if we look at the history, it doesn't talk about land ownership and the theft of lands and so forth. So we wanted a story that could be legitimate and could be in line with current society. We see that history tends to hide away many of the disasters that have taken place through time. So to take ownership of time was a very political decision, I think. In the past, it was an incorrect decision. Politically incorrect, not in a good way. I mean, we decided to stick to. If we wanted to stick to documentary lines, we would be telling a story full of lies. You can talk about different types of history and so forth, but I really wanted to use the wisdom that we share in Latin America, the common wisdom that is part of history. And I thought we didn't have to share that common history. We see that a lot of the gestures in the film used by men, the men's gestures, are very feminine. I thought we had to change this. We don't necessarily have to portray soldiers as manly as we have until now. And I doubt that they were that way, so manly, so So heroes, such hero figures. I thought we didn't have to be loyal to those lines. And those were the original construction lines of the film.
Let's open it up for questions. If you have a question, please can you stand up and wait for the mic? And I see one right at the back.
Hi, big fan here. I just wanted to know about the partnership with Brazil, how it happened, and also the choice of Matheus Nastergaile for the role of, I don't know if I can say it or I'll spoil it.
Bueno, mira, la relación con
If we look
Vania
at
Catani, que es la productora
the relationship that we have with Vania Catani from Brazil started in 2008 in Havana Film Festival. This woman came up to me and she offered to make a film about work by Clarice Lispector. I thought it was a good idea, but I found it to be somewhat strange. I was surprised that she had so much enthusiasm about me. I'm not used to someone coming up to me and telling me to do a film about something, about another work. And I told her I couldn't do so at the time. And we left it at that. But when I came to raise funds for Sama in 2012, I took an important step for the existence of Sama, raising funds. And then this person came back. We were in contact again, and then this woman, she wanted me to be in contact with one of the great writers in Latin America, so that I would film a movie about it, make a film about it. And so that's why we were in touch. Our relationship started at that point. And Vania was very, she found many links with El Desierto de los Tártaros, another film. Both of these films are based on fiction works, on novels that are interesting and have a lot in common. That's where we started working together. And I'm proud of the fact that we were able to have an Argentinian-Brazilian co-production, a real one, where Brazil brought a lot to the narrative lines. We have 4 different actors from Brazil, 4 or 5. We have Mateus, we have 2 other characters. Aim Malemba was also there. Mariana Nunes. The arts director is also Brazilian. One of the editing jobs, one of the editing projects was also made with a Brazilian persons. And then the Bajaras Indians are also Brazilian. It's unusual to find projects of co-production that are related in the narrative line. We made the film on borders, as we saw borders in the 18th century, and we were able to do this, and it was very great because usually co-productions in Argentina are usually projects of trying to join funds to make a project that would otherwise not be able to succeed in a single country. We also see Latin American, European countries, films where we don't understand what the European influence is. And I think we're lucky enough to see a production that has a very productive collaboration from a narrative point of view. So I'm really happy with this, with the Brazilian contribution. I thought it was important to really establish a link between the construction of the teams, the financing aspect, as well as the narrative lines, not just finding funds and joining them. Of course, we have to join funds in the end, but it's good to collaborate in other aspects.
There was a question over there. Yeah, the little bit further back on the, I think was up last time, and I see a couple here as well. So.
Sí. May I in Spanish or English?
I think it'll be heard by the translator, and the interpreter, and she can translate it.
To Spanish?
Yeah.
Sí.
No, from English.
From
English. Spanish. Speak in Spanish.
Yes. Sí. Quería...
Así vivo yo acá.
Sí, ya te entiendo.
That's the way I live here. I wanted to ask you about the role played by the element of water. You have a short film about fish. We see water being present in Ciénaga. We see it in Niña Santa. And then we also see it in Zama, a very present element of rivers and water. And I think you give a lot of relevance to spaces with water. Could you comment on this? I think this is a very useful question. I think I'll be able to use this tool. It looks like a small... It looks like we're on an American TV show when I take this, but this is my only way of making this clear. If you look at this box, for me, something that was fundamental to me after making Ciénaga, something that is fundamental to cinema. I did not have a university level training when studying cinema, so I decided to train myself, and I wanted to move away from the training that you receive at cinema schools. Training programs are essential for filmmakers, but in the end, it can also limit them. It can submerge them into a bubble from which they have to break free in order to make cinema. And so I have this concept, this system called submersion. Can you all see this properly? I'll just put it on the table. The concept is called diving, submersion, or immersion. The first experience we can have as children, the first immersion experience is when we dive into a swimming pool. We immerse ourselves into the swimming pool. But now with any mobile phone, you can take your own phone to represent the lights surface of the pool. If you can bring the lights down, I can make a magic trick right on stage. Can you bring them completely down, the lights? If we look at this box and we see it as a swimming pool and we try to dive in with as much air as we can in our lungs, we will experience a childhood experience, which is the experience of diving, of submerging oneself, of immersion. I have breathing problems, but anyone without breathing problems knows that it can feel very frightening not to have any air in your lungs, to be underwater or somewhere where you cannot breathe, where everyone is breathing, but you're the only one that cannot breathe. Can you keep the light down, please? Can you keep the darkness? Yeah, thank you. Because it's a long explanation. So it goes as follows. If we are at this point of the pool, at the bottom if we dive into the bottom, we see that water is an elastic, a flexible space. So anything that falls into the water in which I am submerged, I will feel the vibrations of water. My body will feel the presence of someone that dives into the pool, the sounds that comes from the surface. We will hear this. I will hear this in my ears, but I will also feel the vibrations that are generated in the water. And if we have this pool and we take it upside down, if we turn it around, it is a cinema room, right? So the spectator is submerged in a field of air, and sounds is what enabled cinema to be 3D. We cannot have 3 dimensions that are stronger than sounds. Sound changes the air. Sound creates movements in the air. The waves of sounds move along the room, around the space, and they generate different types of pressure around the spectators. What does this mean? Well, it means that the element in which the spectators are immersed is sounds in the end. You can close your eyes and you stop watching the film. You stop seeing the film, but you still hear the sounds of the film, and it is quite possible for us to perceive volume. Deep sounds can create very strong waves of sound, and you can perceive this on the surface of your skin. And this is where spectators are submerged. And the surface of lights that we see on the mobile phone is a small cut within a much larger universe, a huge universe. And the space of cinema is infinite, is huge. The surface of the screen is finite. It has its limits, it's flat. So sound goes beyond the image in the end. It submerges, it takes over the space. So I think image is one cut in our world, and sound enables us to submerge the spectators in the space. You can turn the lights back on now. You won't forget about this experience, I hope. So, with this small idea, with a small anecdote, I started thinking of different ways of seeing time, of seeing writing and filming in the end. The idea of immersion and dissolution of things, disintegration of things. So if I, for example, decided to take this pool and I decided to dilute an object. If I take, for example, this glass and put it inside, this glass would be dissolved by the container. It may sound very abstract, but it's very practical in the end. What are the attributes of one glass? A glass has sounds, a very concrete shape, the way we use it, the places in which we place the glass. We don't place them in a horizontal way. We usually place it in a vertical way. We use it in certain situations to drink water, and so forth. All of the characteristics that a glass may have, if we dilute the characteristics, we can use the idea and apply it to all scenes. Because I don't need the whole glass. I need some aspects of the glass to give more presence, to make it present. It's difficult to translate this into cinema, but if you look at La Ciénaga, for example, the swamp, when we decided to construct tension of this film, this is not film noir, but there's a lot of tension present in the film, and I decided to use certain narrative lines and apply them to different characteristics of the scenes. I could even dare say that all of the aspects of the film are present in all of its scenes, through all of its scenes, by means of a sound or a reference that give presence to things or to actions that took place in other scenes or actions that will take place in later scenes. Why am I telling you this? I'm not telling you to put glasses into boxes. It might sound unnecessary, but we need to think of different tools to see, to feel, to listen to what surrounds us. If we look at the imprisonments that our education systems or our surroundings merge us, white supremacy, for example, then we're limiting ourselves, and we need to move away from those cultural boxes. We need to make a huge effort to move away from our own limitations. We have access to good museums. We're able to travel nowadays. We're able to see the great works of our culture, and we end up closing our own perspective on the world. So we need to find different tools in order to move away from that, to sort of challenge our perception, challenge our own ways or means of perception, to challenge them and to break from them and try to see other things. And this immersion technique was really useful for me. I don't know if it will be useful in the future, but I think it was already very useful. The fact, thinking of myself as a species immersed in air is also useful, because things also have waves, create waves that affect us. I like thinking of the world as a world filled with space, where space can have a repercussion or can affect others. And I think this is very useful, no? The way we can affect each other. I don't know if I'm dwelling too much on this. Do I have time, Simon?
I think we're running out of time, but it's a very good closing speech.
Well, as last thing, I would like to tell you another idea about volume. Cinema tends to think about linear timelines. Linear timelines that have been very useful, that have been very productive in masterpieces, but that are not useful for everyone. And so, if we look at timelines is very associated with our perspective. Future, past, if we think of future and past, we draw a line with an arrow, and we think of cause and consequence, of beginning and end. This is, of course, very useful. But sometimes we forget the fact that this is an invention. Time has no direction. Some scientists say that there is no timeline. I don't like to think of time as something within a beginning and an end. I like to think of it from sounds instead of vision. I like to think of time as volume, where, say, this volume, this box is time. This may irritate the most scientific among us, because it doesn't have a lot of scientific evidence. But if time was contained in this volume, all of the particles that are usually organized in a timeline with cause and consequence and so forth, if it was all found within this container, if all of the events were found, if all of the particles of events were found within this volume, and we had to build a narrative based on this time, it wouldn't be so easy to find meaning in time. We wouldn't be able to find cause and consequence, or we would have to reflect a lot more in order to trace a relation between cause and effect. We would have to think with more depth. So, having a jar like this in your own home can be useful to reflect on time and to somehow realize that the way we think, the way we organize perception, is based on a general idea. And I think it's important to know that the first thing in cinema is to challenge ourselves first. Because if we don't challenge our own perception, we won't be able to see anything. I recently gave a talk in Spain, and I gave this example. I hope this video won't appear on YouTube, but I said that if there was someone that came to an extraterrestrial, an alien came to why the food from a restaurant is different from food found in a garbage. He would see the differences in lights, in color, and we are trained to think that a certain food is better than another. An alien wouldn't see this, and this is something we have to see in cinema. Cinema is a great opportunity to challenge ourselves, to make ourselves as alien to the earth, and to try and see something different, to try and see many things that stand right before our eyes, things that we see in our daily lives, things that we accept in our daily lives that are unacceptable, things that we would normally accept. And I think that's what cinema can do, to change your vision. And we need to make inventions to change this, because otherwise we end up being blind. That is what we try to fight against, not being blind. Thank you.